Being an astronaut seems like an awfully serious thing, doesn't it? After all, they operate in the most inhospitable place in the universe, space, where dangers are abound and nothing is ever risk-free. Still though, they're only human, and it's nice to let loose and have some fun from time to time. So, with that said, here are 10 times that astronauts were caught messing around and goofing off. Project Gemini. It was the 1960s and the dawn of human spaceflight, an era where to survive you had to be made of the right stuff, and, generally speaking, a military test pilot. And if there's one thing that the military know how to do, it's let off some steam after coming face to face with mortal peril. John Young was a US Navy test pilot and member of NASA Astronaut Group 2, the so-called Next 9, which also included Pete Conrad, Jim Lovell, Jim McDivitt, Frank Borman, Elliot See., Tom Stafford and Neil Armstrong, several of whom will appear on this list. In March 1965, Young and Mercury 7 astronaut Gus Grissom flew the Gemini 3 mission aboard their capsule Molly Brown, the first crewed flight of the second NASA manned space program. Grissom, being no stranger to time and space, became bored with the pre-planned, freeze-dried meal selection they'd tested during training. So Young, together with well-known practical joker Wally Schirra, who we'll come back later to in this list, hatched a plan. Pre-flight, Schirra went to a well-known restaurant, an astronaut favourite hangout spot in Cocoa Beach, where he ordered a surprise delectable for Grissom in the shape of a corned beef sandwich. He smuggled it into NASA and, ahead of the suit-up, passed it to John Young, who stashed it in his spacesuit. Just hours later, that tasty sandwich blasted off into space, and after all the official stuff was done post-launch, Young decided it was time for a spot of lunch. Yes, John Young, who would later walk on the moon and command the space shuttle, smuggled a corned beef on rye sandwich into space. Probably not the best idea he ever had, as crumbs broke off and flew everywhere inside the tiny capsule, causing NASA to, quote, take steps to prevent recurrence of corned beef sandwiches in future flights. Speaking of things smuggled aboard spacecraft, perhaps few are as famous, or infamous, as in the case of Apollo-14. It was the fourth planned moon landing by NASA, the third after the success of Apollo 11, and the first back following the fateful flight of Apollo 13. Everything had to go well. And so it mostly did, with plenty of science conducted and moon rock samples collected. But, much like John Young, and unbeknownst to the folks back at Houston Mission Control, Commander Alan Shepard was about to unleash a plan that had been years in the making. Following a successful EVA, Shepard and Edgar Mitchell returned to the lunar module, where, in front of an awaiting TV camera, he pulled out from his spacesuit a custom-made Wilson 6-iron golf club head, which he had smuggled onto the flight. He duly attached it to a sample collection tool rod and then whipped out a couple of balls before playing the moon's first ever game of golf. Of course, he botched the first shot but struck the second. So, how far did Shepard hit his history-making shot? Well, many years later, the shot was calculated to have travelled just over 40 yards. We're not quite sure where the final hole was and whether that was on par, but hey, props to Shepard for trying. The International Space Station has seen its fair share of astronauts spend considerable time aboard the world's longest orbiting science laboratory. And of course, in amongst all this science conducted, it's openly mandatory for them to engage in some cardiovascular activities to help abate the muscle degradation that occurs with living in a microgravity environment. But the crews of Expedition 39 and 40 during 2014 were in an especially festive mood thanks to the onset of the 2014 Football World Cup. And to mark this occasion, Reed Wiseman, Steve Swanson and Alexander Gerst played their very own game of zero-G football. The crew of Red Dwarf would be very proud. See, the ISS is roughly the same length as a standard football pitch, so it was the perfect place to kick off the start of the tournament, including showing off their skills. Who said you can't be an astronaut and be football daft at the same time? Apollo 12 was the second mission to land on the moon, with NASA astronauts Pete Conrad and Al Bean becoming the third and fourth humans to walk where only Neil and Buzz had gone before. This was a serious affair. A longer stay was planned and more science would be carried out to prove that the first time hadn't just been a fluke. This all-Navy crew took Command Module Yankee Clipper and Lunar Module Intrepid into the Big Black. Despite the Saturn V having been hit by lightning during ascent, giving rise to that now famous of callouts, set SCE to aux. Of course, this wouldn't be the only time lightning struck on this mission. The backup crew for the flight was an all-Air Force crew, which included Dave Scott, who would later walk on the moon as part of Apollo 15. And of course, there was an inter-service rivalry, which was known for its next-level pranking. It was in this spirit that Dave Scott cooked up perhaps the cheekiest endeavour on this list. When Pete Conrad set foot upon the surface, he set about getting down to business. And because there are so many items to tick off with each EVA, astronauts had handy flip charts attached to their wrists. But, unbeknownst to Pete, when he flipped open his list, he was greeted by pictures of peaks he wasn't expecting to encounter on the moon: Playboy centerfolds. Yep, we're not quite sure if Pete did in fact survey her activity in the end, but this one went down in legend. And needless to say, the prank wasn't discovered until astronauts got back to Earth. This next one comes courtesy of the crew of Skylab 3 and their wives. Skylab is one of those oft-forgotten series of missions that came between the end of Apollo and the beginning of the Space Shuttle era. It was the United States' first space station and, as of 2025, the only one it exclusively operated between 1973 and 1974. The second crewed mission to the station, Skylab 3, lasted 59 days and saw astronauts Al Bean, Owen Garriott and Jack Lousma carry out over 1,000 science experiments on board. But that didn't mean they didn't get to have a little fun too. 10th of September 1973 was just another routine day on board Skylab, with controllers back in Houston continuing to monitor their instruments, and Capcom Bob Crippen relaying various messages to the crew. But during the evening, he was startled to hear a woman's voice come across the comm.
Skylab, Houston, AOS Carnarvon, 5 minutes.
Hello, Houston? This is Skylab. Are you reading me down there?
Skylab, this is Houston. I heard you all right, but I had a little difficulty recognizing your voice. Who we got on the line here?
Oh, Houston, Roger. Well, I haven't talked with you for a while. Isn't that you down there, Bob?
The woman, revealing herself as Helen Garriott, wife of Owen, continued to talk to Bob for quite some time, alluding to her having been a stowaway and having decided to take the crew a nice home-cooked meal.
This is Helen here in Skylab. The boys hadn't had a home-cooked meal in so long, I thought I'd just bring one up.
What poor Bob Crippen didn't realise was that this was an elaborate prank set up by Owen Garriott well ahead of the mission, having sat down with Helen to have her record some lines that he could then play back via tape recorder. Talk about commitment to the prank. In fact, the whole thing wasn't revealed fully until 25 years later.
See you later, Bob.
Scott Kelly is a bit of a modern astronaut legend, having flown to the ISS 4 times, including his famous one-year stint as part of expeditions 43 to 46. It was during the latter, which included British astronaut Tim Peake, that perhaps his most famous moment occurred. After one failed attempt in 2015, his brother and fellow astronaut Mark Kelly arranged to have a gorilla suit sent up in February 2016, just in time for Scott's birthday. In full view of the onboard cameras, Scott pulled the rather large package from a cargo dragon supply ship and climbed into the bag. He then burst out of the bag in full gorilla suit and proceeded to chase Tim Peake down a corridor. But that wasn't all, because he later hid in one of the astronauts' sleeping quarters and burst out, giving him quite the scare, as well as casually floating along to the Russian segment of the station and giving them all a surprise too. Now, who says it's all Westerners that can have a laugh in space? After all, Russians, via the old Soviet Union, were the first to send humans into the Big Black, so it's only right that they were also among the first to pull pranks. Not much is known about the early days, but one for sure happened during the historic Apollo-Soyuz mission in 1975. It was the very end of the golden age of space exploration, and the last mission of the Apollo era. A symbolic gesture of relaxed tensions between two superpowers locked in a Cold War, and the beginning of decades of cooperation was planned. It saw the last Apollo command module dock with a Soyuz 7KTM. The two crews were legendary. On the US side was Tom Stafford, veteran of 2 Gemini missions and Apollo 10, alongside Deke Slayton, part of the original Mercury 7 and on his only spaceflight, as well as Vance Brand, who would later fly on 3 space shuttle missions. They were joined in space by Russians Alexei Leonov, the first human to walk in space, and Valery Kubasov, veteran of Soyuz 6. In honour of this historic flight, alongside that well-publicised handshake, gifts were also exchanged, and Leonov handed the Americans some toothpaste-style tubes, which he assured them contained vodka. What better way to cap off the mission with a drink between the crews? Tom Stafford and Deke Slayton resisted the idea, but eventually relented, only to be greeted by a mouthful of Russian borscht, or a sour soup made from beets. Leonov had in fact glued fake labels to the tubes. It's said that the Americans were a bit upset by this, but we're not sure to this day if that's due to the taste, or the fact that they didn't get that drink of vodka after all. Of all the legendary figures that arose during the NASA Apollo missions, perhaps none are quite so unassuming as Günter Wendt. Affectionately known amongst the astronauts as Der Führer of der Launchpad, having been so named by John Glenn during Project Mercury, he was a mechanical engineer, and in fact the launchpad leader, the last face astronauts would see before their capsule hatch was closed and they were blasted into space. It was a serious role, but Günter was no stranger to a prank. In December 1972, Apollo 17 would become to date the last time humans would set off for the moon and walk upon its surface. This mission would be led by veteran Gene Cernan. Just before the mission, Gene was due to speak at a press conference, after having attended a reception in his honour, presented by Günter Wendt. At around 8 p.m, Cernan said his goodbyes and headed outside before jumping into his open-topped Chevy. But after starting it up, he found that the car just wouldn't move. The car was parked on sand, and the more he tried, the more that he found the wheels just kept on spinning. Cernan was worried and furious at the prospect of being late for media duties. But just then, one of the launch team members appeared and called over to him, saying, "Hey buddy, you think you can get to the moon? You can't even get out of the sand." Cernan shouted back, "Well, you guys can send me to the moon, but you can't even pull me out of the sand." Another chimed in, "Hey, Gene, why don't you just get rid of the bricks?" Gene looked down, saw that his car had been propped up on bricks, and realised he'd been on the receiving end of one of the astronauts and pad team's biggest, longest standing pranks. A gotcha. It was later revealed that while Cernan had been at the reception desk, Günter Wendt had snuck outside, bricks in hand, and got Gene Cernan big time. Gemini 6 and 7 were the first 2 spacecraft to successfully rendezvous together in space in 1965. Gemini 6 was originally planned to launch within a Gina target vehicle. However, the Agena was lost on liftoff and Gemini 6 was scrubbed. 2 months later, Gemini 7 launched on a planned 14-day trip. But rather than waste the opportunity, the renamed Gemini 6A took off just 8 days later to attempt a catch-up in space with its sister spacecraft. On board were Tom Stafford and Wally Schirra, perhaps one of NASA's greatest pranksters, and both of whom who have already had a mention on this list. The two spacecraft carefully maneuvered themselves into position, and just a few hours after Gemini 6 blasted off, the two vehicles came together, ending up no more than just 30 centimeters apart. Talk about precision maneuvering. The next day, Gemini 6A moved away from Gemini 7 and prepared to re-enter Earth's atmosphere. During final preparations, a somewhat bemused crew came on the radio and made a shocking announcement to Houston Mission Control.
Roger, Houston and Gemini 7, this is Gemini 6. We have an object, looks like a satellite, going from north to south, probably in a polar orbit. He's in a very low trajectory, traveling from north to south, and has a very high fineness ratio. Looks like it might even be a bonus thing. It's very low, looks like maybe going 300 pretty soon. Stand by one. Looks like he's trying to signal something.
At that point, the sound of a harmonica and bells could be heard, giving a rendition of Jingle Bells through the radio. Stafford and Schirra had in fact played a Christmas-themed prank on Houston, causing Elliot C. to quip,
"You're too much, 6.
That was live, 7, not tape.
Not only was this one of the earliest and best pranks in space, played during a tense moment for Mission Control, but it was in fact also the very first live musical performance played beyond the confines of Earth. Finally, on our journey, we have what is, in my opinion, the very best of astronauts goofing off with a moment of, well, I'll never get the chance again. Apollo 17, as we've already mentioned, was the last NASA mission to land humans on the surface of the moon. Gene Cernan would be joined on the lunar surface by the first civilian, non-military astronaut and scientist, Dr. Harrison Schmitt, a geologist who had spent years training as an astronaut and lending his expertise to the Apollo cause. After a grueling 3 days on the moon, the two astronauts made their way back to the lunar module. Gene Cernan's poignant remarks before climbing in as the last human to touch the surface of our sister rock in space will go down in history, but it was perhaps Schmidt's final act that has gone down in infamy. Sensing an opportunity, and perhaps wishing to add an extra event to the Lunar Olympics started by the crew of Apollo 14, Schmitt asked Gene Cernan for his hammer, noticing that he was about to drop it. Schmitt then asked Cernan if he could throw it.
You're a geologist, you ought to be able to throw it. You ready?
Then, in what was to date humanity's very last extravehicular activity on the moon, Harrison Schmitt lobbed that hammer as far as he could.
Look at that! Look at that! Look at that! Beautiful. Looked like it was going 1,000,000 miles, but it really didn't. Didn't it?
That act and Cernan's words would close out the greatest chapter in the history of spaceflight. But for as long as humans continue to ascend to the stars, their humour will always follow too. Now, I would consider that the greatest collection of pranks in the history of spaceflight. If you like this video, give it a like and support the channel by subscribing or by becoming a channel member. As ever, a big thank you to all my Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for watching. I've been Tom June, and I'll catch you next time.